expect that you'll continue in that reforming vein, but you'll also continue to initiate bills in this House from the Justice Department, because I think we've had some really good debates, some really good committee stage debates, particularly on justice bills in this House since 2011, and I hope you'll continue to do so. So you're very welcome indeed. The bill is also very welcome. It's long overdue, as others have pointed out. I think it's been widely welcomed generally. Others, and you, Minister, have spoken of the genesis of the bill, developed from Law Reform Commission recommendations, and indeed, I suppose, effectively a redraft of the bill introduced in 2010, but I must say a greatly improved redraft, and I think that improvement has been acknowledged again widely, and in particular by the Irish Human Rights Commission. And again, others have referred to the Commission's most recent observations on this bill, which were produced in March 2014, in which they pointed out that their recommendations on the 2010 version of the bill, many of those recommendations have been incorporated into this bill, and the Human Rights Commission, I think, very importantly acknowledged the significance of the amendments made, particularly in respect of Part 10 of the bill, in relation to destruction of samples and removal of profiles. And I know your predecessor commented when he introduced this bill that the really significant change was that the presumption now is in favour of destruction of samples and profiles, where previously it was in favour of retention, and that the onus has shifted from the person from whom samples were taken to the Commissioner in some instances. So certainly that's a very important improvement, and I think we all very much welcome that. I think we do all acknowledge also the difficulty in achieving a proportionate balance between the rights of the person who's the source of a DNA profile or the subject of from whom samples are taken, their rights to bodily integrity, as Senator Donovan has said, and to privacy, as against the wider public interest in preventing crime and in detecting and investigating offences. So I think we do acknowledge the difficulty of achieving that balance, and also the fact that we're doing it in a context of international law, of European Court of Human Rights judgments, notably the Marper judgment, which you referred to in 2008, and that we have to be mindful of all of those factors too. I think, however, other countries, happily for us, other jurisdictions have moved to legislate before now. I think the British database has been in place since the mid-90s, I think, and certainly, this is something that we really need to have in place. We need to have a statutory framework for the Forensic Science Laboratory. I know Dr. Sheila Willis and other staff from the laboratory are here. I know it's going to be renamed Forensic Science Ireland, but I do want to acknowledge the great work that the forensic scientists have done in the state service, and I know will continue to do, but I think they'll be very much facilitated in their work with this new statutory framework that they have been looking for, and that many of us in the criminal justice system have been looking for some time. So it's hugely important to have this framework in place. And I just wanted to look a little more at some of the provisions in it that are particularly welcome, I think, and just to comment a little on some where perhaps we may wish to see further review. And I know Senator Conway referred to the welcome the Human Rights Commission gave. I think it's fair to say they did also suggest some changes that they felt would improve the bill even further, while acknowledging the changes had been made both since 2010, but also indeed at committee stage in the other House, where I know there were a number of changes made. But I think they still made other recommendations they would like to see in place, and perhaps we can discuss those further, of course, at committee stage in this House. Just to say a little bit more, though, about sort of the somewhat complex structure of the bill, that that's inevitable given the very many different scenarios this bill tackles. And just trying to get a sort of an overview of it from a practitioner point of view, I think it's important to say parts 2 and 4 really will be of huge practical significance to members of An Garda Síochána, to criminal justice practitioners, and those two relate to part 2 relating to the taking of samples from persons in custody in Garda stations, which will of course refer to anyone who goes into custody from the commencement of the bill. And then of course part 4 referring to samples from offenders for the reference index or DNA database system. And that will refer effectively to people who may already currently be serving sentences of imprisonment or have been convicted. So those are two that are very particularly important parts, and in which I think there must be really, we must ensure intense scrutiny of the balance reached in those sections and those provisions, particularly sections 11 to 13 and sections 31 to 32 relating to the taking of samples. There's also, of course, then very different scenarios where again samples are taken. So in part 3, taking of samples from volunteers to generate DNA profiles, with the provision in there on mass screening in section 29. And I know that that's one area that the Human Rights Commission has pointed out must be the implementation of that section must be scrutinised very carefully to ensure, for example, that it isn't used for racial profiling. And I think that we'd all be very mindful of that, of the need to ensure safeguards there. Part 5 of the bill refers to, again, a very specific and very different scenario, the taking of samples for elimination purposes, largely from members of Garda Síochána, to make sure that they are not, that they can be excluded from suspects in a crime scene. But then we also have in Part 6 a very different, again, and very important provision of samples for identification purposes for the DNA database, really relating to missing persons and so on, which again is a different sort of scenario. I think the other parts then relate to how the taking of samples are carried out, and in Part 7, the taking of samples for protected persons and children. And I very much welcome the fact that there are such specific provisions relating to the taking of samples from protected persons and children. I think I also particularly welcome the provisions in Part 9 on the DNA Oversight Committee, the introduction of an independent oversight committee to be chaired by a judge, and which will have the duty of laying annual reports before the Oireachtas. And again, I welcome that. On the justice side, we are already in the practice of hearing from the Minister for Justice with the annual reports on the implementation of the provisions of the Offences Against the State legislation. And I must say it's always very useful, because in that report we get data, we get figures and statistics as to how many times each particular provision of the Offences Against the State legislation has been used. So I very much hope we'll see that level of detail in the annual reports laid before the Oireachtas from this independent oversight committee. I do note one recommendation from the Human Rights Commission, which is that the committee would include one member with human rights expertise. Now, I think that it may be that, and certainly one would expect a judge would have that to start with, but it may be that it would be worth looking at some specific provision for that. Part 10 of the bill, of course, is hugely significant, and this is where, as you said, Minister, the really significant changes were made compared to the 2010 bill. And I note that in respect of Part 10, the Human Rights Commission has made very few recommendations, in fact, and I think in particular, you know, it's very welcome to see the provisions for review of the time periods for which profiles may be retained, because I know, you know, there was concern about the periods of the length of time. I know the idea of 6 years and 3 years, there was certainly questions raised, and I spoke with colleagues about when the bill was first introduced. There was a question as to why were the periods this long, and you know, should the commissioner have to seek permission of the court to retain samples, particularly where a person is not convicted? So you know, these are some of the questions asked. But I think the review provisions deal with that, because you know, it's very good to see that Section 96 provides, as you said, for downward review only, that we look at the different retention periods. The Minister is tasked with looking at those, but only with a view to reviewing them downward rather than upward.
I have a minute left.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I know we can go into this level of detail at committee stage, but I suppose just to say finally that you know, as I say, parts 2 and 4 are hugely important. Part 2, there have been important amendments made, particularly, which have been very welcomed by, I know, civil liberties groups, particularly in relation to the negative inferences. As a former defence practitioner myself, we don't like these provisions around the drawing of negative inferences. I'm glad to see that convictions can't be based wholly or mainly on the drawing of such inferences. But it is something that I think, you know, we may look at in the context of Section 157, which deals with the codes of practice, that as the Human Rights Commission has said, there may be a case for a very specific warning to be given. I know there's provisions for information to be provided to persons from whom samples are to be taken, but you know, should we go further? Should we look in a code of practice at setting out specific wording? You know, there's I suppose more specific wording provided for where samples are being taken from children and protected persons, but all persons in custody are in a vulnerable position when samples are being taken from them, particularly where we have provisions, as you've said yourself, you know, authorising the use of reasonable force. So I think we do need to look at the appropriate safeguards in terms of the language used, particularly where people may be subject to the drawing of negative inferences at a subsequent trial when samples are being taken from them. them while in Garda custody. So I know we can deal with all of these issues in much more detail at committee stage, but just to say again how much I welcome that we are now at the stage of having this bill in front of us, and I know the Forensic Science Laboratory are very glad to see as well that it will eventually be becoming law without too much more delay. And I'm sure, Minister, just the time frame, I'm sure we'll be able to process committee and report stage before the summer. Thank you.
Senator Flaherty.
Für mil mad Harley agus the head fighter of Tada agus achna macholake buanam gachra a weird the role no more addedly agus conanas the silum gnaida galet. Minister, since the early 2000s a number of attempts have been made to establish a DNA